Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Those people that are interested in health, those people that are interested in improving their diet, they require knowledge on the quality of foods. They need to know whether a food is of high quality or low quality. And I talk about high quality and low quality foods a lot. And in particular, I talk about consuming high quality carbohydrate foods. One of the measures of the quality of a carbohydrate is the glycemic index. And many people use the glycemic index, particularly those people who are trying to lose weight, in order to be able to determine whether they should eat that food or not. Now, I think the glycemic index has a place in nutrition. It's a very interesting research tool, but I think it's overstated in terms of an average person who is not in a research setting, in a real life situation. I think the glycemic index has to be always taken in context. If I explain first what the glycemic index is, and then I talk about the glycemic load, you'll perhaps see the problems there are with using the glycemic index as a reference as to whether the foods on there are of high or low quality. Now, the glycemic index is a measure of the glycemic effect that you get from a particular food, and what that means is how much does your blood sugar go up after you've consumed a certain quantity of carbohydrate in the form of a particular food. The glycemic index uses pure glucose or white bread as a reference and gives that a value of 100, and all of the carbohydrate foods are measured against that value and given a value that corresponds to the reference food. So, for example, cornflakes have a glycemic index of 82. So if we consume 50 grams of carbohydrate in the form of glucose or white bread, and then we consume 50 grams of carbohydrate from cornflakes, we would only have 82% of the increase in glucose from the cornflakes as we got from the glucose or the white bread. So the carbohydrate content is always the same. So you always have to take the same amount of carbohydrate content. It's always related to the same carbohydrate content. Now, that's very interesting, and it means that you can create a nice table of all the foods. So cornflakes have a glycemic index of 82, fructose has a glycemic index of 20, for example, and that's very interesting, and you can create this table, but it doesn't really tell you whether the food is of high quality or low quality. All it tells you is that in relation to white bread or glucose, you will get X amount of blood sugar increase. We're interested in why the blood sugar goes up because there's increasing evidence that large and rapid rises in blood glucose levels are detrimental to the health, and in particular they can possibly lead to insulin resistance and weight gain. The problem with the glycemic index is that it measures a specific quantity of carbohydrate within the food, and that is not often realistic. The glycemic load is perhaps a better measure of the carbohydrate content or the quality of the carbohydrate in a food, but it's not so often available to the public, it's not so often used. Now, the reason the glycemic load is a better measure of the quality of the carbohydrate is because it takes into account the amount of the actual food that you would consume. It doesn't compare like for like amounts of carbohydrate. And that's important because some of these foods we don't eat in the quantities that are in the glycemic index compared with glucose. And if I give you an example to illustrate this, you'll perhaps see why the glycemic load is a better measure of the quality of the carbohydrate. If we take parsnips, for example, parsnips have a glycemic index of 92. They have a glycemic index between about 92 and 95, depending on the table that you use. Some tables give values as high as 98, and that really depends on the research that they're taking the table from. But let's say it's in the high 90s, somewhere in the 90s for parsnips, and that's a very high glycemic index, and somebody that was looking at the glycemic index to pick the quality of their carbohydrates might actually look at that and think, well, actually I'll avoid parsnips because they have a high glycemic index. And that's true, they do. The problem with that is that it is measuring the same amount of carbohydrate in parsnips in comparison to glucose or white bread. It's very easy, for example, to consume 50 grams of carbohydrate from glucose. You can put that in a drink and you could drink it within a few seconds. The point is that parsnips don't contain much carbohydrate. You'd have to eat an awful lot of parsnips to be able to get that 50 grams of carbohydrate. The realistic situation is that somebody would generally eat 2 or 3 portions of a parsnip, maybe not even a whole parsnip, and that would provide a very small amount of carbohydrate. So although if you consumed 50 grams of parsnips, it would give you a very large increase in blood sugar. The reality of the situation is we don't ever eat that amount of parsnips. We only have a very small amount relative to other foods, and therefore, even though the sugar in parsnips could theoretically give you a large rise in blood glucose, that doesn't happen because of the small amount of carbohydrate that's actually present in the food. So the glycemic load really modulates the glycemic index because it takes into account the amount of food that we normally consume of all the particular foods. So cornflakes, for example, it's very easy to consume 50 grams of carbohydrate from cornflakes, and therefore the glycemic load of cornflakes is very close to the glycemic index. The glycemic load of parsnips is much lower than the glycemic index because of the small amount of carbohydrate that are in parsnips. And this is why it's very important to look beyond the glycemic index. I'll give you another example of why it's very important and why the glycemic index is not a good measure of the quality of the carbohydrate. And that's if we look at fructose and sucrose. They both have very low glycemic indices, and therefore if you look at the glycemic index table, you would assume that they were high quality carbohydrates because they don't cause a rapid rise in blood glucose levels. And I've actually read nutrition books that have said that sucrose and fructose are preferential carbohydrates to consume because of this low glycemic indices that they have. The problem is that the fructose moiety of sugar and fructose in its refined crystalline form are actually metabolic poisons. They damage the liver if you have them at a certain quantity in the diet. There's a lot of evidence that if you consume refined crystalline sucrose or refined crystalline fructose, that fructose is converted, it is metabolized in the liver, it's converted to fatty acids, and there is evidence that those fatty acids may lead to insulin resistance. So therefore, it's not the glycemic index is not a good indicator of the quality of the carbohydrate. There are some carbohydrates on the glycemic index that are low and they would appear to be of high quality, and there are some that are very high. Parsnips are a healthy food and they should be incorporated into a healthy diet. There's nothing wrong with consuming a few parsnips. Yes, they have a high glycemic index, but their glycemic load is very small because the actual quantity of carbohydrate within them is very small. And therefore the glycemic index should be used as a tool. It's a useful indicator. It's very useful in a research setting, but the glycemic load is a much better measure of the quality of the carbohydrate. There are many vegetables on the glycemic index that are high, and I wouldn't advocate avoiding them from a healthy diet. And so this is very important to understand, and if I would suggest that you have a look at both the glycemic load and the glycemic index of various foods and see where they fit together with other factors that should be taken into account as to whether these foods are of high quality or not. For example, if a food is of whole grain, in other words, many cereal grains are refined, they have their bran and their germ layers removed, and that removes much of the fibre and of the micronutrients in the cereal grain. If you consume whole grains, you're getting that bran and that germ that bran and the germ layers, and therefore you're getting the micronutrients and the fibre within the cereal grain. So that is another measure of the quality of the carbohydrates, and that again you will find whole grain cereals that are high on the glycemic index, and you will find refined cereals that are perhaps lower on the glycemic index, and that is not really a good reflection of the quality of the carbohydrates of foods as a whole. So really what I'm saying is the glycemic index is a useful tool. It's very interesting to look at the various glycemic indices of food, but it should always be taken in context. The glycemic load is perhaps a better measure, and really we should be moving away from the glycemic index towards the glycemic load. And there are actually other methods of measuring the quality of the carbohydrates, such as the amount of insulin that is released following consumption of a food. And also you have to look at the whole context of the food in terms of whether it's been refined or not, and how much fibre it has, how many micronutrients it contains, and these other measures are also important to take into account. So don't get fixated on the glycemic index. Yes, it's useful, but it should always be taken in context. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that if you, when you're looking for your choices of carbohydrates in the future, that you can take this into account. And if you do, then you should be able to put together a high quality diet based on your knowledge of whether you think these carbohydrates are good quality foods. If you have any comments about this video, if you want to make ask any questions, please leave your question or comments in the boxes below this video, and as always I will try to get back to you, and I will see you again for another video soon, and in the meantime, take care.